If you ask most people who the one person a narcissist cannot destroy is, the answers are usually very similar. They will say, the strongest person, the most confident person, the one who dares to stand up, to fight back, to speak the truth. But that assumption is wrong. In reality, the people who try the hardest to appear strong are often the ones pulled deepest into the narcissist's game. Because a narcissist is not threatened by strength, they live off it. They need confrontation, they need intense emotion, they need reaction, whether it is anger, pain, or moral outrage. The person they cannot destroy is not the one who defeats them in arguments, not the one who exposes their mask in public, and not the one who lives in resentment. It is a completely different kind of person. A kind of person the narcissist has no tools to deal with. Not loud, not dramatic. In fact, from the outside, this person may even appear weaker. But it is precisely this weakness, the inner withdrawal, the absence of ego investment that becomes the point where the narcissist's entire structure of control begins to collapse. And that is the person we will talk about today. The only person a narcissist cannot destroy, and also the person you were never taught to become. Part 1. What narcissists actually use to control people. Most people believe that a narcissist controls others through domination, through sharp words, power, or overt manipulation. But that is only the surface. If it stopped there, they would never be able to maintain power for so long, nor would they be able to trap intelligent, empathic people with deep inner value for years at a time. The truth is this: narcissists do not control you through strength. They control you through access to your inner world. They do not need to defeat you. They only need to enter. From the very beginning, a narcissist is not seeking attachment in the ordinary sense. They are seeking an external system that can regulate emotions they cannot regulate themselves. That is why they are especially drawn to people with rich inner lives. People who can feel deeply, think deeply, reflect inwardly, and care about right and wrong, justice and injustice, meaning and meaninglessness. These people are often not loud, but they are deep. And that depth creates a doorway. When a narcissist enters a relationship, they do not enter as an invader. They enter as a connector. They listen, they mirror, they empathize, and in the process they gradually identify something crucial: how you regulate your emotions. What kind of understanding do you need to feel okay? How much reassurance do you require? How do you react when you are misunderstood? When you are met with silence? When you are doubted? When warmth is withdrawn? This is not curiosity. It is mapping. Because once a narcissist knows what your inner peace depends on externally, on explanations, on validation, on being correctly seen, on the feeling that everything will be okay if I just try a little harder from that moment on, the relationship is no longer two people meeting. It becomes a structure, and within that structure, emotions are no longer just emotions. They become leverage. A narcissist does not need to hurt you constantly. In fact, they rarely do. They alternate. A little warmth, a little withdrawal, a partial apology, an ambiguous silence. One moment that makes you believe they understand, followed by another that makes you wonder what you did wrong. This fluctuation creates emotional intensity, and that intensity makes you react faster than your capacity to think. When emotion moves faster than cognition, you can no longer perceive the whole picture. You begin to live in isolated moments. Today they are gentle, yesterday they were cold, this morning they needed you, last night they disappeared. You explain each fragment instead of seeing the pattern. And that is when the narcissist's control is strongest, not because they are stronger, but because you are blurring your own perception in order to preserve hope. The critical point here is this: narcissists do not dominate by imposing their beliefs onto you. They dominate by making you doubt your own beliefs. When you begin to question whether your feelings are reasonable, whether you are too sensitive, whether you misunderstood, power has already shifted, not to them, but away from you. And the higher your inner moral compass, the more dangerous this shift becomes, because you are inclined to turn inward, to self-examine, to self-correct. You believe that if you communicate better, stay calmer, be kinder, things will become clear. What you do not realize is this. In a narcissistic structure, clarity is not the goal, it is the threat. A narcissist does not need you to be wrong. They only need you to be unsure that you are right. That is why they do not destroy you through direct attack. They destroy you by making you dependent on their feedback to feel okay. When that happens, every time they go silent, you lose direction. Every time they withdraw, you feel empty. Every time they misunderstand you, you rush to correct it, not to communicate, but to save your sense of inner wholeness. This is why winning against a narcissist through argument almost always fails. Because arguing is still engagement. Explaining is still investment. Demanding fairness is still placing your emotional stability in someone else's hands. And a narcissist does not need to win the argument. They only need you to keep playing. Understanding this is the first step toward recognizing an uncomfortable truth. Narcissists cannot control someone who does not need them for inner regulation. Not because that person is stronger, but because they do not grant access. Once you understand this, something else begins to become clear. Not everyone is controlled in the same way. There are people who enter relationships with narcissists and seem to hold out longer than others. They push back, they speak up, they stand up for their values, and from the outside, they appear to be the strongest people in the room. But it is precisely here that a very dangerous illusion emerges. Because if outward strength were truly what stripped a narcissist of power, they would have retreated very early on. Reality shows the opposite. Those who appear strong in visible ways are often pulled in deeper, not less. This raises an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. Is what we call strength actually strength? Or is it simply another form of participation? A more refined way of continuing to feed the very structure we believe we are resisting? To answer that, we need to go deeper into the illusion of strength and why it becomes the largest doorway for a narcissist to enter. Part 2. The illusion of strength. Why those who seem untouchable are often the most trapped. There is a paradox that is very difficult to accept when it comes to narcissists. They are not threatened by what we usually call strength. In fact, they are drawn to it. Confidence, sharpness, eloquence, strong reasoning, intense emotion, even morality and righteousness, all of these, when placed inside a narcissistic structure, become points of attachment. This is the first illusion. Believing that if you are strong enough, clear enough, firm enough, the narcissist will not be able to affect you. But narcissists do not operate through confrontational logic. They operate through psychological friction. And outward strength generates a great deal of friction. The strong person is often the one who reacts quickly. They do not accept being misunderstood. They speak up, correct, argue, defend boundaries, assert their value. In healthy relationships, these behaviors are necessary. But in a narcissistic dynamic, every reaction, even a justified one, is a signal. It signals that you care, that you are invested, that there is something inside you that needs to be recognized, needs to be set right. A narcissist does not need you to be wrong. They only need you to participate. The second illusion lies in a moral belief. If I explain clearly enough, fairly enough, kindly enough, they will understand. This belief is beautiful. It comes from empathy and the desire to repair. But in the hands of a narcissist, it becomes a loop. Each time you try to clarify, you unintentionally reinforce that your inner stability depends on being understood by them. And at that point, understanding or not understanding becomes a tool. There are people who appear extremely untouchable, because they do not stay silent. They confront. They speak the truth. They name harmful behavior. But what is often unseen is this: they are placing their ego at the center of the relationship. And narcissists are very skilled at working with ego. They can attack it, flatter it, challenge it, or force it to defend itself. Either way, connection is maintained, and that connection is the resource. Here emerges the third illusion, confusing strength with intensity. Strong emotion is often seen as a sign of aliveness, of authenticity, but intensity is not sovereignty. On the contrary, high intensity often narrows perception. When you are swept into emotional peaks, love, anger, hope, disappointment, you begin to react moment by moment. You process each situation separately, instead of seeing the entire trajectory. And narcissists thrive in that gap. They do not need consistency. They only need enough variation to keep you thinking, explaining, self-adjusting. When they are warm today and cold tomorrow, you do not ask, "What is the pattern?" You ask, "What just happened?" The second question keeps you inside the loop. The first takes you outside. The illusion of strength makes you believe you are controlling the game, when in reality you are already deep inside it. Another subtle aspect of this illusion is the fusion of personal value with interaction outcomes. Strong people often believe that if they do the right thing, the outcome will reflect that. But in a narcissistic structure, outcomes do not reflect value, they reflect leverage. The more you invest in the belief that this must end fairly, the easier it is to keep you there. Not because you are weak, but because you respect meaning. And narcissists exploit that by delaying, distorting, and offering vague promises. This is where the greatest illusion reveals itself, believing that confrontation will end control. In reality, the opposite is true. Confrontation is a form of high-intensity participation. It activates reflexes, arguments, morality, and the need for validation. A narcissist may lose a single confrontation, but they win the structure because you are still there, still reacting, still proving who you are. The strength a narcissist cannot deal with is not expressive strength, but strength that does not need expression, not a loud voice, but silence without resentment. Not boundaries that are declared, but boundaries that are lived. Not confidence that needs to be seen, but an identity that does not need to be confirmed. That is why the illusion of strength does not only deceive you, it keeps you there. It makes you believe you are progressing because you are clearer, stronger, more forceful. But real progress in this context is not measured by intensity. It is measured by role withdrawal. How long has it been since you no longer needed feedback? How long since you no longer needed to be understood in order to feel okay? How long since outcomes stopped defining your value? Only when this illusion dissolves does another kind of strength come into view, the strength of someone who no longer needs to win in order to exist. And it is precisely at this point that we begin to see clearly the figure of the only one. The person a narcissist cannot destroy, not because they are stronger, but because they have stepped out of the game. Part 3. The moment of inner role withdrawal, when you stop performing and the narcissist's power disappears. The moment of inner role withdrawal does not arrive as a decisive choice. It does not resemble an oath, a bold declaration, or a final confrontation. On the contrary, it comes quietly, almost mundanely. It often begins with a feeling that is hard to name, no longer the anger you once felt, but no longer hope either. A faint emptiness mixed with fatigue. Not fatigue from pain, but fatigue from having to keep becoming a certain version of yourself so that the relationship can continue to exist. You begin to realize that all this time, you were not merely living inside the relationship, you were holding it up through empathy, through endurance, through explaining, adjusting, softening, being patient, and doubting yourself. You were the one filling the gaps the other person could not fill on their own. You were the one maintaining the rhythm, the meaning, the emotional continuity for both of you. And then, at some point, a very small point, you stop doing that. Not because you want to punish anyone, not because you have forgiven or have moved on, but because a truth becomes so clear that it can no longer be ignored. If you continue playing this role, you will lose yourself. Not in a dramatic way, but in a slower, quieter way you will live without the sense that you are living for yourself. What does inner role withdrawal mean? It is not cutting off immediately, not absolute silence, and certainly not becoming cold. Inner role withdrawal is when you stop supplying your ego to the relationship. You no longer react automatically. You no longer explain automatically. You no longer rush to fill silences with anxiety or hope. You begin to let the emptiness remain where it is. This is difficult, because before, you were the one who could not tolerate the gap. When they were silent, you thought. When they misunderstood, you corrected. When they withdrew, you moved closer. The entire narcissistic structure survives on this rhythm. And when you withdraw your role, that rhythm is disrupted. Not immediately, not loudly, but enough to create a misalignment. The narcissist begins to sense that something is no longer right. They may not be able to name it yet, but they feel it clearly. You are no longer in your familiar position. The old tactic, silence, blame, seduction, vague apologies, no longer produce the same effect. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you no longer regulate yourself around them. From the outside, this withdrawal may look like weakness. You speak less, you react less, you explain less. But on the inside, a new structure is forming. You begin to feel your emotions without needing to act on them immediately. You allow sadness to exist without trying to fix it. You allow uncertainty to exist without running to seek validation. This is the fundamental difference between giving up and withdrawing your role. Giving up is abandoning hope. Withdrawing your role is reclaiming inner sovereignty. You do not abandon emotion, you simply stop letting emotion dictate every action. You do not deny needs, you stop placing those needs in the hands of someone who has already shown that they cannot or will not meet them in a healthy way. When you withdraw your role, something very important happens. The relationship loses its function as a psychological regulation system. Before, whenever tension arose, you were the one who processed it. Whenever conflict appeared, you were the one who kept the narrative intact. Now, when you stop doing that, tension is no longer discharged outward. It returns to where it belongs. And that is precisely what the narcissist cannot tolerate. They are not accustomed to holding their own emotions, not accustomed to being alone with uncertainty, not accustomed to having no one to mirror, validate, or soothe their ego. So when you withdraw your role, they may escalate their behavior, becoming more intense, more dramatic, even sweeter. Not because you matter more, but because the system is running out of fuel. But if you can maintain this withdrawal, not through tension, but through stability, something irreversible begins to happen. You start living from the inside, rather than living to sustain the relationship. You no longer need to know what they think in order to know where you stand. You no longer need outcomes to confirm your worth. You no longer need an ending they acknowledge in order to feel that your story is real. At this point, the narcissist has nothing left to destroy, because there is no role left for them to invade, no ego waiting to be recognized, no structure that depends on their presence. The irony is this: you do not become stronger in the way the world usually defines strength. You do not win. You do not turn the tables. You simply stop playing. And in a game where power exists only through participation, stopping the game is absolute neutralization. The moment of inner role withdrawal does not make you cold. It brings you back to your own rhythm of living. back to emotions that no longer need explanation, back to a stillness that no longer means abandonment. And in that stillness, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. The person a narcissist cannot destroy was never the strongest person in the room, but the one who is no longer standing on the stage. Part 4. What happens in the narcissist's mind when you withdraw your role? When you withdraw your inner role, the first thing to understand is this. A narcissist does not experience loss in the usual way. They do not feel it as grief attached to a specific person, but as a disruption in their psychological regulation system. Before, you were not just someone in their life, you were a function, an anchor point, a reflective surface. And when you withdraw, what disappears is not love, but a false sense of stability. In the initial stage, narcissists often do not immediately realize what has changed, because on the surface you may still be there, you may still respond, still be polite, still appear fine. But what they were accustomed to, your emotional availability, your quick reactions, your quiet anxiety, is gone. And this absence has no clear form. It cannot be criticized. It cannot be argued against. It cannot be blamed on anyone. This is when confusion begins. The narcissist starts to feel out of sync. Behaviors that once produced strong effects, silence that made you worry, vague reproaches that pushed you into self-examination, a moment of warmth that pulled you back, no longer generate the same response. Not that there is no response, but it is not enough, not fast enough, not intense enough, not enough for them to feel that they are still controlling the flow. And within that confusion, a familiar mechanism is activated: escalation. Escalation does not necessarily mean aggression. Sometimes it is very subtle. The narcissist may become sweeter, more vulnerable, even more honest. They may say the very things you once longed to hear, not because they have changed, but because the system is running out of fuel. When the old method no longer works, they try another. The goal remains the same: to restore access to your inner world. If sweetness does not work, escalation may move in the opposite direction. More blame, clearer accusations, a sense of urgency, the creation of crises, because crises force people to react. And reaction is what the narcissist needs to know that they still have a place in your structure. But when you maintain your withdrawal not through effort, but through inner stability, something deeper occurs. The narcissist begins to face what they have always avoided: their own emptiness. Previously, whenever there was inner tension, they could project it outward onto you. Their discomfort became your fault. Their insecurity became a relationship problem. Their emptiness was filled by your emotional reactions. But when you withdraw your role, this projection mechanism gets stuck. There is nowhere to push it, no one left to carry it. This is the stage where many narcissists experience a form of inner disorientation, not always consciously, but very clearly on a felt level. They feel emptier, more restless, and uncomfortable without knowing why. They may say that you have changed, that you have become cold, that the relationship is not the same anymore. But what they are really saying is the old system no longer works. At this stage, narcissists typically have two main responses, neither of which aims at healing. One is to accelerate the search for another source, a new person, new attention, a new stage, not because you were not enough, but because you no longer fit the structure. The second is to try to pull you back into the old role, often by reactivating intense emotions: guilt, nostalgia, pity, or unresolved hope. What is important to see is this: in both responses, the narcissist does not approach you as a whole person. They approach you as a variable in the equation of their inner stability. And when that variable no longer functions, they either replace it or attempt to recalibrate rather than confront themselves. If you sustain your withdrawal long enough, an unavoidable truth emerges in their mind. They can no longer control you in familiar ways. Not because you have become stronger, but because you are no longer willing to participate in the loop. There is no one left to persuade, no one left to confuse, no one left to pull into the right-wrong game. From this point, the narcissist may say many things about you. They may construct a new story in which you are cold, ungrateful, or changed. But these stories no longer affect you the way they once did, because you no longer need their agreement to validate your reality. And here lies the deepest paradox. You do not need to do anything more for them to lose power. No exposure, no victory, no deliberate silence. You only need to continue living from a place where your inner life is no longer organized around their reactions. At this point, the narcissist is not defeated. They become disoriented. And in a system where power exists only through participation, this disorientation is the sign of the end. The most important part is this. You do not need to fully understand what is happening in their mind for this to work. You only need to understand what is happening within yourself. And from there, the next step is not to keep analyzing the narcissist, but to recognize something deeper. When you withdraw your role, not only do they lose power, you begin to restructure yourself. And that is where we will go next. Part 5. When you move on, why this is the final blow. There is a very common misunderstanding. People believe that the final blow to a narcissist must be an action, an exposure, a decisive departure, a deliberate silence, or a symbolic victory. But what truly ends a narcissist's power is not an action, it is a state. The state in which you continue living without carrying them inside the structure of your inner world. Moving on here does not mean feeling better immediately, nor does it mean appearing happy to prove anything. It is a deeper shift. You stop organizing your days, your emotions, and your decisions around the question, how will this affect them? When that question disappears, the relationship, whether there is still contact or not, has already ended psychologically. What causes a narcissist to collapse is not that you leave, but that you no longer remain in the role of the mirror, the role of the one who holds the rhythm, the role of the one who makes their contradictions livable. When you move on, that role is no longer reenacted day after day. And without a role, there is no stage. At first, narcissists often do not believe this. They are accustomed to others moving on, only on the surface, being busy, meeting someone new, going silent while still carrying them inside, still waiting for closure and acknowledgement, a sign of remorse. So they test. An unexpected message, a recalled memory, a half-hearted gesture, not to connect, but to check. Do I still exist somewhere in your inner world? And if you have truly moved on, the answer comes not through words, but through the absence of energy, not ignoring tension, but a lack of pull, no climax, no prolonged explanations, no need to rewrite the story, just one deeply uncomfortable reality for them. You no longer need anything from them in order to continue being yourself. At this point, many people fear that they have become numb. But this is a misunderstanding. Numbness is when nothing matters anymore. Moving on is when something else matters more. Work, relationships with mutual flow, a rhythm of life that does not require drama, choices that do not need justification. When your axis of meaning shifts, the narcissist is no longer at the center. And when they are no longer at the center, every tactic loses its place. What is striking is this. You do not need to defeat them in any confrontation to reach this point. In fact, every attempt to win keeps you within their orbit. Moving on is when you no longer need outcomes. No need to be chosen. No need to be understood. No need to be vindicated. No need for an ending signed by them. When that need disappears, the narcissist's power does not weaken, it dissolves. From a psychological perspective, This is when the emotional economy between the two of you collapses. Narcissists live by creating urgency. Love, hate, closeness, distance, promise, withdrawal, warmth, coldness. Urgency creates attention. Attention creates control. When you move on, there is no urgency. There is nothing at risk inside you for them to press on. What remains, if anything remains, is only the faint echo of a system that has run out of fuel. This is also why many people say that narcissists move on quickly or replace very fast. That does not negate the effectiveness of your moving on. It confirms it. When you no longer fit the structure, they must find somewhere else to place the role. But replacement does not heal the emptiness. It only postpones confrontation. For you, moving on is not replacement. It is reallocation of life. There is a very subtle moment that many people overlook when you realize you no longer think about them in order to make decisions. No longer rehearse imagined conversations. No longer anticipate their reactions. No longer consider whether something will hurt them. When your future no longer revolves around managing someone else's emotions, you have exited the old economy, and this exit is irreversible. From the outside, this may look very ordinary. No drama, no declarations, no public victory. But that very ordinariness is what the narcissist cannot process, because their power requires intensity, requires reaction, requires something to be at stake. When you move on, there is nothing left to threaten. The final blow, therefore, is not silence, but continuation without them. Not turning your back, but moving forward without looking back for energy. You do not become morally superior to them, you become irrelevant to their game. And in a system that lives on relevance, that is the only ending. The most important thing to remember is this. You do not need to wait until you feel completely healed in order to move on. Moving on is not the reward after healing, it is the engine of healing. Each day you organize your life without needing anything from them, you close a door inside. Not loudly, not with added pain, just closing it tightly enough that no more wind can blow through. And when that door closes, the story ends not with their acknowledgement, but with your sovereignty. No need to win, no need to prove. Just move on and let the old power dissolve into silence. The most important thing to understand after everything we have just gone through is this. The person a narcissist cannot destroy was never the strongest person in the room, not the best speaker, not the one who fights back most fiercely, not the one who exposes, defeats, or leaves in dramatic fashion. It is the one who has withdrawn their role, withdrawn from the need to be understood, withdrawn from the hope of repair, withdrawn from the expectation of a fair ending from a system that does not operate on truth. When you withdraw your role, you do not become numb. You become self-governing. You may still feel pain, but you no longer organize your life around that pain. You may still remember, but you no longer use memory to direct your future. You still know what happened, but you no longer need the other person to confirm it for you to feel real. And it is precisely here that the narcissist's power ends. Not because they are defeated, but because there is no one left for them to control. They are not afraid of your anger. They are not afraid of your strength. What they cannot handle is a person who no longer needs them to be whole. True freedom does not come from proving what is right. It comes from the moment you no longer need an outcome. When you move on, leaving no space for manipulation, no longer carrying them within your inner structure, the story ends, quietly, without spectacle, simply closing. And perhaps the deepest truth of this entire journey is this. You do not become a survivor of a narcissist. You simply return to being yourself. There are no roles there, no games, only a life that no longer needs to be controlled, and an old power quietly dissolving into silence.